A medieval scholar saw the stars as both a scientific puzzle and a map of the divine. This video will reveal how the collision of astronomy and faith inside the great medieval observatories forged the very foundation of modern science. We will uncover how a sultan's passion for the stars created the most accurate star chart for centuries, and why a Christian king funded a project that seemed to challenge the heavens themselves. You will discover a lost world where belief did not hinder discovery but powered it. What does it mean to seek truth in a universe filled with meaning? The candle flame flickers, casting dancing shadows across a parchment filled with complex geometric figures. Our scholar looks up from his work, his eyes drawn to the bright points of light scattered across the night sky. For him, this is no mere spectacle. It is a sacred text written in fire, a perfect creation demanding to be read. The common tale of a dark age for science is a profound misconception. This was in fact a world humming with intellectual energy. In great libraries from Baghdad to Toledo, scholars were weaving together threads of knowledge from ancient Greece, Persia, India, and the Islamic world, creating a rich tapestry of understanding. At the very heart of this endeavor was a powerful and unifying idea. The universe was the deliberate work of a divine architect. To measure the paths of the planets, to chart the fixed stars, was not an act of defiance. It was the highest form of devotion, a way to comprehend the mind of the Creator through the perfection of His creation. This pious curiosity crystallized into a specific model of the cosmos, one championed by the ancient astronomer Ptolemy. Imagine the universe as a series of perfect, transparent spheres nested inside one another like a cosmic onion. At the very center rests the Earth, unmoving. Each of the 7 known planets, including the Sun and the Moon, is carried on its own crystalline sphere, rotating in complex, beautiful loops known as epicycles. The outermost sphere holds the fixed stars, a glittering canopy marking the boundary between the created world and the divine. This Ptolemaic system was not some fringe theory. It was the established doctrine, elegantly explaining the observed motions of the heavens, and most importantly, fitting perfectly within a worldview that placed humanity in a cosmos full of purpose and meaning. This is why the observatory was destined to become more than just a scientific tool. It was a bridge. From its platforms, one could literally reach for the heavens, using mathematics and observation to touch the divine machinery itself. This cosmic bridge found its first great pillars not in Europe, but in the radiant city of Baghdad. By the 9th century, the city was a humming intellectual crossroads, where the caliph's own thirst for knowledge fueled an unprecedented project. The House of Wisdom was less a single building and more a sprawling campus of the mind, a library and research institute on a scale the world had scarcely seen. Its shelves groaned under the weight of countless manuscripts, but its true power lay in the work being done, not just stored. Here, under the generous patronage of the Abbasid Caliphate, a directive from the highest level of power was clear. To seek knowledge was a sacred act, a religious virtue in Islam that demanded the faithful observe and understand God's creation. This spiritual imperative drew brilliant minds like a magnet. The Banu Musa brothers, 3 gifted scholars, designed intricate astronomical instruments. The mathematician al-Khwarizmi, whose name would give us the word algorithm, performed calculations that would shape mathematics for centuries. Their mission was synthesis. They took the complex astronomical works of the Greeks, like Ptolemy's own Almagest, and merged them with new observations made from their own courtyards. The result of this fusion was the creation of incredibly accurate astronomical tables known as Zij. Think of a Zij as a massive celestial calendar and calculator combined. It could predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, tell you the exact time for prayer based on the sun's height, and even forecast lunar eclipses. This was not abstract science. It was a practical tool for navigating both the physical and spiritual worlds, born directly from the conviction that faith and reason were two paths to the same divine truth. The House of Wisdom established a powerful template, proving that deep religious devotion could be the very engine for a golden age of discovery. This model of pious learning would soon travel far beyond the deserts, inspiring other rulers to look up and build their own bridges to the stars. The intellectual fire lit in Baghdad would not be extinguished even by the thunder of hooves. As the Mongol armies swept across Persia, they brought with them a conqueror named Uluğ Khan. His grandfather was the legendary Genghis Khan, a man who had forged an empire from the steppes, but Uluğ was different. He saw a power beyond the sword, a power contained in the stars themselves. High in the rugged hills of 13th century Persia, on a plateau overlooking the city of Maragheh, he ordered the construction of a scientific fortress unlike any the world had ever seen. This was not merely an observatory, it was a city of knowledge, a monument to a new kind of conquest. Its director was a man whose mind was as vast as the skies he studied. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was a brilliant theologian, a philosopher, and a scientist all at once. For him, these were not separate roles, but different facets of a single quest for truth. He was deeply troubled by a persistent problem. The old Ptolemaic models, for all their elegance, were slightly wrong. The observed paths of the planets, particularly Mars, did not match the predictions with perfect precision. This was more than a mathematical nuisance. It was a philosophical and theological crack in the perfect celestial spheres. If the universe was a divine creation, why did its machinery seem to have a flaw? Al-Tusi's genius was to find a solution that repaired the model without breaking its philosophical foundation. He invented a breathtakingly simple yet powerful mathematical device now known as the Tusi-couple. Imagine two circles, one small and one large, with the small one rolling perfectly along the inside of the larger one. This elegant motion, purely circular and thus perfectly acceptable within the rules of Aristotelian physics, could generate a straight line. This was the key. Al-Tusi used this couple to mathematically model the wobbles and loops in planetary orbits without needing to violate the sacred principle of perfect circular motion. He fixed the heavens with geometry, preserving both the accuracy of observation and the harmony of his faith. The Maragheh Observatory itself was the physical manifestation of this unified pursuit. Its library was said to hold an astonishing 400,000 manuscripts, a collection of the world's knowledge gathered from every corner of the empire. At its heart stood a massive mural quadrant, a giant stone arc fixed to a wall, allowing astronomers to measure the altitude of stars with unprecedented precision. Scholars of different faiths, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Buddhists, all worked side by side, united by a common language of mathematics and a shared desire to understand the cosmos. Here, the collision of astronomy and faith did not create an explosion, but a symphony. The drive for theological harmony had not stifled innovation. It had demanded it, leading to a technical leap that would echo through the centuries. The legacy of Maragheh was a challenge whispered across the trade routes of Asia, a call to look higher and measure more precisely. It was a challenge answered not by a distant scholar, but by a king in his own palace. The city of Samarkand in the 15th century was the glittering jewel of the Timurid Empire, a place of turquoise domes and bustling markets. And its governor, Uluğ Bey, was a man whose true court was the night sky. As a grandson of the fearsome conqueror Timur, he was born to rule with an iron fist. yet his heart belonged to the silent, orderly procession of the stars. For him, the throne was a duty, but the observatory was a calling. He ordered the construction of an instrument of such staggering ambition it still inspires awe. Carved directly into the bedrock of a Samarkand hillside was a colossal meridian arc, a giant sextant with a radius of over 130 feet. This was not a portable device but a permanent, immovable part of the landscape itself, designed to eliminate the tiniest errors of smaller tools. Think of it as a stone protractor the size of a modern building, its curved track allowing astronomers to measure the altitude of stars as they crossed the meridian with a level of precision the world had never known. And Uluğ Bey was not a distant patron. He was often there on the platform, his royal robes exchanged for the focus of a scholar, peering along the sighting lines of his great instrument, personally confirming the data that would become his life's work. His faith was the engine of this relentless pursuit. He believed that to study the heavens was to engage in the highest form of worship, a direct inquiry into the flawless geometry of God's design. Every star plotted, every planetary position calculated, was a verse read from the divine text of creation. This pious obsession culminated in the Tusi-couple, a star catalogue and set of astronomical tables of such breathtaking accuracy that it would remain the most reliable reference in both the East and the West for over 2 centuries. Here was a sultan whose greatest conquest was not of lands but of uncertainty. He proved that the most powerful form of leadership could be a personal, passionate investment in the expansion of human knowledge, a legacy written not in edicts but in the immutable positions of the stars. Far to the west, in the sun-drenched kingdom of 13th century Castile, a different kind of royal court was proving that this marriage of faith and science was no isolated phenomenon. Here, in a land where the call to prayer from a mosque mingled with the bells of a cathedral, King Alfonso X ruled not just with political ambition, but with an insatiable intellectual curiosity. His court was a vibrant hub of translation and collaboration, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, their shared language the universal tongue of mathematics. Alfonso looked up at the same night sky that preoccupied the sultans of the East and saw the same divine mechanism. He famously remarked that had he been present at the creation, he could have given the Creator some useful hints. This was not blasphemy, but the highest form of flattery. He believed the universe was so perfectly and rationally constructed that a human mind could, in fact, grasp its underlying logic. This conviction drove him to commission one of the most ambitious scientific projects of the medieval Christian world, the creation of new planetary tables that would bear his name. The Alfonsine Tables were not an act of rebellion against religious doctrine. They were a painstaking effort to fine-tune the clockwork of God. The king assembled a team of the finest astronomers, many of them Jewish scholars who brought with them the deep astronomical knowledge of the Arabic world. For years, they pored over existing texts, cross-referenced observations made from Toledo, and performed countless calculations. The result was a monumental synthesis, a set of tables that combined the best of Arabic astronomy, particularly the work from places like Maragheh, with new data and refinements. These tables allowed one to predict the future positions of the planets, the dates of eclipses, and the complex dance of the cosmos with a new level of reliability. They became the standard reference for European astronomers, navigators, and astrologers for the next 3 centuries. This entire endeavor was fueled by a powerful medieval Christian concept known as natural philosophy. This was the idea that the natural world was a book, a second scripture written by the hand of God. To study the movement of the stars, the properties of a stone, or the flow of water was not to challenge faith. It was to read the book of nature, to appreciate the wisdom and orderly mind of the Creator through the intricate details of his creation. For King Alfonso, funding this great project was not a distraction from his royal and religious duties. It was an essential part of them. A wise king sought to understand the laws that governed God's universe, for in that understanding lay a deeper reverence for the lawgiver himself. The observatories of the East and the translation tables of the West were all chapters in the same story. But what happens when the observations made from these bridges to the divine begin to reveal a cosmos that does not match the ancient maps? Yet for all the grandeur of these great observatories, their most profound insights could be held in the palm of your hand. The Astrolabe was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, a brass disc so intricately carved it looked less like a tool and more like a piece of captured starlight. Its design was a miniature model of the cosmos itself. The main body, the mater or mother, held a series of engraved plates, each one a map of the sky calibrated for a specific latitude. Laid over this was the reter, a delicate, web-like fretwork of pointers representing the brightest fixed stars. When you held an astrolabe up by its ring, letting it hang plumb, you were suspending a portable universe between your fingers. You could rotate the reter over the plate, mimicking the daily turn of the stars, and by aligning specific stars with engraved altitude lines, you could solve dozens of celestial puzzles. It was, in essence, a sophisticated analog computer for a world without silicon chips, but its true power lay in how it served two masters, the soul and the body, with equal brilliance. For a Muslim scholar standing in a courtyard, the astrolabe was a direct link to the divine. The 5 daily prayers are dictated by the sun's position. The Fajr prayer begins at the first hint of dawn, the Maghrib prayer the moment the sun disappears below the horizon. The astrolabe could calculate these precise, shifting times for any day of the year. More than that, it could find the Qibla, the sacred direction toward Mecca, from any location on Earth. By sighting the sun or a known star, the user could align the instrument to reveal the correct orientation for prayer, turning a scientific observation into an act of profound devotion. At the very same moment, a sailor on the deck of a ship in the Mediterranean or a merchant traveling the Silk Road would use an identical instrument for an entirely different, yet equally vital purpose. For them, the astrolabe was a key to earthly navigation. By measuring the height of the North Star above the horizon, they could determine their latitude, knowing exactly how far north or south they had traveled. They could tell the local time at night, a crucial piece of information for planning a watch or a journey. This single, beautiful object physically embodied the seamless integration of faith and science that defined the age. It was a tool for finding God and for finding your way, proving that the desire to understand your place in the cosmos was both a spiritual and a practical necessity. The universe it modeled was still the orderly, earth-centered cosmos of Ptolemy, a perfect machine whose gears could be traced in polished brass. But what would happen when the observations made with tools like this began to suggest the machine itself was flawed? The polished brass of the astrolabe was a marvel of portability, but to truly pin down the heavens, you needed something you could not hold. You needed an instrument that was part of the earth itself. This was the era of the monumental, of devices so large and so permanently anchored they became part of the landscape. High on the plateau of Maragheh, embedded in the observatory's walls, was one such device, the mural quadrant. Imagine a giant stone protractor, a 90-degree arc carved with painstaking precision and fixed perfectly along a north-south line. This was not a tool for a traveler's pocket. It was a scientific cathedral's foundation stone. An astronomer would stand before this immense arc, sighting a star through a movable alidade, a sighting rule along its curved track. The sheer size of the quadrant, sometimes spanning many feet across, meant its scale could be minutely divided. Where a handheld astrolabe might give you a reading to the nearest degree, the mural quadrant could pinpoint a star's altitude to a fraction of that. It was engineering on a scale designed to eliminate the trembling of a human hand, to filter out the tiny errors that, over centuries, had accumulated into significant flaws in the celestial models. Alongside the quadrant stood another titan of the observatory, the armillary sphere. While often crafted as a beautiful teaching model, its largest versions were formidable observational tools. Picture a skeletal model of the cosmos forged in metal, a series of nested rings representing the great circles of the sky, the celestial equator, the ecliptic path of the sun, and the meridian. Each ring was meticulously aligned with the Earth's axis and the plane of its orbit. By rotating these rings and sighting stars through tiny pinholes along their circumference, an astronomer could measure celestial coordinates in 3 dimensions. It was like holding the entire Ptolemaic universe in your hands, but this time you were using its own perfect geometry to check its work. Building these instruments was an act of devotion that demanded a king's ransom. The resources required, the teams of skilled stonemasons, metalworkers, and engravers, were far beyond the means of any single scholar. This is where the deep alliance between faith and power became concrete. A sultan like Uluğ Bey or a caliph like the ones who funded the House of Wisdom did not see this as a frivolous expense. They were glorifying God by building monuments to the study of His creation. The observatory itself was a form of prayer written in stone and brass. The data that flowed from these massive instruments was unlike anything that had come before. It was consistent, repeatable, and trusted. This new flood of reliable numbers created a slow but mounting pressure on the old cosmic order. How could you ignore a tiny, persistent discrepancy in the position of Mars when it was measured not with a guess, but against the immutable scale of a stone arc carved into a mountain? The quest for divine precision, funded by piety, was quietly assembling the evidence that would one day require a new divinity to be understood. This need for celestial precision was not a matter of abstract philosophy. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life and worship, governing time itself. For both the great medieval faiths, the correct observance of holy days depended entirely on the accurate reading of the sky, a task that demanded the finest astronomy available. The Christian Church faced a problem of immense complexity with the date of Easter. This movable feast was defined by a precise celestial rule. Easter must fall on the first Sunday following the first full moon that occurs on or after the spring equinox. This single sentence tied together the 7-day week, the 29.5-day lunar month, and the 365.25-day solar year. Predicting this confluence of cycles years in advance was a monumental computational task. A mistake could mean entire regions celebrating the resurrection of Christ on different days, a scandal that threatened the unity of Christendom itself. This was not a minor error, it was a crack in the foundation of religious authority. To prevent this, the Church became one of the foremost patrons of astronomy. Monks in scriptoria across Europe pored over planetary tables like the Alfonsine Tables, copying and refining them. The great universities, often religious foundations, made the calculation of Easter a central part of their curriculum. The ecclesiastical need to fix a date on the calendar directly funded the scientific work that advanced humanity's understanding of time. Across the Mediterranean, the Islamic world operated on a different but equally demanding celestial schedule. Its calendar is purely lunar, with 12 months that cycle through the seasons over a 33-year period. The beginning of each month, especially the holy month of Ramadan and the festivals that follow, is marked by the physical sighting of the faintest sliver of a new crescent moon. A cloudy night could delay the declaration of a new month, throwing an entire empire's religious rhythm into uncertainty. This reliance on observation created a powerful incentive for Muslims to master the science of lunar motion. Could the new moon be seen tonight from Cairo or from Baghdad? Astronomers were tasked with creating ever more accurate models to predict the moon's position and visibility. They developed complex criteria to determine if the crescent would be visible above the horizon after sunset, balancing mathematical calculation with the physical limitations of human sight. This was astronomy in the service of communal unity, ensuring millions could begin their fasts and celebrate their feasts in unison. The spiritual need to worship at the correct time, as decreed by the heavens, made the astronomer an indispensable figure. The observatory was not a luxury. It was a vital institution for maintaining the rhythm of faith, a place where the motion of the moon and stars directly shaped the prayers of the people. This sacred deadline for celestial data pushed the science of observation further than it had ever gone before. But this perfect cosmic clockwork was beginning to show its first faint cracks. The deep faith that powered the observatories also demanded absolute honesty in their readings, and the data itself was becoming difficult to ignore. For centuries, the Aristotelian Ptolemaic model had provided a comfortable home for the soul, a universe with humanity at its center, encased in perfect, unchanging spheres. This vision was not just scientifically convenient. It was theologically appealing, aligning with a literal interpretation of a universe created for and around mankind. Yet the stars, when measured with ever greater precision, told a subtly different story. The planets, particularly Mars, stubbornly refused to follow their predicted paths with perfect fidelity. These were not large errors, but small, persistent discrepancies that accumulated over time, like a clock that loses a few seconds each day. For a scholar who believed God's creation was flawless, this was a profound puzzle. How could the divine machinery have a glitch? Into this growing tension stepped a brilliant mind from the 11th century, Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as al-Haytham. He was a man of deep faith and a relentless empiricist, famous for his revolutionary work in optics. His approach to knowledge was simple yet radical. Do not simply accept what the ancient authorities, even Aristotle, have declared. Truth is not found in the pages of a book alone, but through direct observation and rigorous experiment. He applied this same sharp-eyed scrutiny to the heavens themselves. In his work, Doubts Concerning Ptolemy, he did not attack the geocentric model out of hand. Instead, he meticulously pointed out the internal contradictions in Ptolemy's own complex system of epicycles and equants. He argued that these mathematical devices were not just clumsy. They were physically impossible within the very rules of perfect circular motion that the model was supposed to uphold. This was not an atheist attacking religion. This was a devout believer insisting that if the universe was God's work, then its logic must be consistent and comprehensible from the ground up. This created a delicate and uncomfortable dance for scholars across the medieval world. They were not choosing between science and faith. The conflict was far more nuanced. It was a tension between different ways of reading divine truth. On one hand were the sacred texts, the revealed word of God. On the other was the book of nature, the physical universe itself, which was also believed to be a direct expression of God's will. What happened when these two books seemed to tell conflicting stories? For thinkers like al-Haytham, and later in Europe, figures like Jean Buridan and Nicole Orsme, the answer was not to reject faith, but to refine their interpretation of both books. Perhaps the problem was not with God's creation, but with humanity's limited understanding of it. Maybe the language of the Book of Nature was more complex and mathematical than previously imagined. This intellectual friction, born from a pious desire for consistency, was the very engine of scientific progress, the drive to resolve the discrepancy between observation and theory, to make the divine machine run smoothly again, would ultimately push astronomy toward a revolution. The quest to prove God's perfection was quietly laying the groundwork for a cosmos that was far grander and far less centered on humanity than anyone had ever dreamed. This theological tension between ancient authority and observable reality finally snapped in the city of Paris in the year 1277. The Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier, acting under the authority of the Pope, issued a stunning decree. He formally condemned 219 specific philosophical and theological propositions being taught at the University of Paris. This was not a vague warning. It was a precise list of forbidden ideas, and at its heart was a fierce defense of God's absolute power. Tempier was targeting the rigid Aristotelian worldview that had become so dominant in European thought. Scholars had begun to treat Aristotle's physics as unchangeable dogma, even when it led to conclusions that seemed to limit God. For instance, Aristotelian philosophy argued that a vacuum was an impossibility, and that the universe was eternal and uncreated. Bishop Tempier declared that such ideas were heresies. God's power was not bound by Aristotle's logic. If God wished to create a void, a complete emptiness, he could. If he willed the heavens to move in a straight line rather than a circle, they would obey. The condemnation was intended as a fortress for orthodoxy, a wall to protect faith from the encroachment of radical philosophy. But history is filled with such unintended consequences. By forcefully breaking the intellectual monopoly of Aristotelianism, Bishop Tempier's decree did something extraordinary. It accidentally created a space for speculation. It gave scholars a kind of theological permission slip to imagine how the cosmos might work differently. If God's absolute power meant the world could operate by other rules, then perhaps the task of the natural philosopher was not just to read Aristotle, but to go out and actually observe how God had, in fact, chosen to build his creation. This opened a door for thinkers to propose alternative models without immediately facing charges of impiety. They were not challenging God, they were exploring the infinite possibilities of his boundless will. The condemnation of 1277 demonstrates a profound historical irony. A religious act designed to enforce a specific doctrine ended up loosening the chains on scientific imagination. It encouraged a shift away from pure philosophical deduction and toward a more empirical, questioning approach. The universe was no longer just what Aristotle said it must be. It was what God had made it, and its true nature could only be discovered by looking upward with curious and open eyes. The intellectual currents flowing from Baghdad, Maragheh, and Samarkand did not travel in isolation. They were channeled and amplified by one of the most ambitious collaborative projects in human history, a centuries-long enterprise of translation that wove a single tapestry of knowledge from threads gathered across the known world. In the great multicultural cities of the Mediterranean, particularly in Toledo, Spain, after its reconquest by Christian kings, something remarkable was happening. Royal libraries, once filled with Arabic texts, became bustling workshops of the mind. Here, in a single scriptorium, you might find a Christian bishop, a Jewish physician, and a Muslim scholar all gathered around the same manuscript. The bishop would read the classical Arabic aloud, the Jewish scholar, fluent in both Arabic and the local Romance vernacular, would translate it into spoken words, and the bishop would then write it down in formal Latin. This was the engine of the translation movement, a human chain of knowledge passing from one language and culture to another. Their work was fueled by a powerful shared conviction. They were not merely copying old books, they were recovering lost wisdom, uncovering the universal truths that God, in His generosity, had revealed to earlier civilizations, whether Greek, Indian, or Persian. A translator like Gerard of Cremona, who traveled to Toledo specifically for this purpose, did not see his life's work as a secular hobby. He saw it as a sacred duty, a way to reclaim the divine light that had been given to humanity. Through this pious labor, the astronomical masterpieces of Ptolemy's Almagest were saved. The revolutionary trigonometric calculations of the Indian astronomer Aryabhatta entered the mainstream. The incredibly precise observations of the Islamic scholar al-Battani, whose work corrected some of Ptolemy's own data, became the new standard for European astronomers. This massive collaborative effort ensured that the celestial knowledge painstakingly gathered in Eastern observatories did not fade away. Instead, it traveled west, carried on a river of ink, to land on the desks of scholars in Oxford, Paris, and Bologna. The pipeline was now complete. A star's position, first measured on a giant stone quadrant in Persia, could be checked against a table compiled in Muslim Spain, and then debated by a Christian monk in a French cathedral school. In an age so often remembered for its religious conflicts, this movement stands as a powerful testament to the opposite impulse, a shared reverence for the cosmos, for the mathematical order that seemed to underpin all of creation, became a powerful unifying force. Faith in this grand endeavor was not a wall dividing communities. It was the very bridge that allowed their finest minds to meet and build upon a common foundation, preserving a legacy that would soon face its greatest challenge. While kings and caliphs built monuments to the stars, the quiet, constant work of astronomy was also thriving behind monastery walls. Here, the collision of faith and science was not a dramatic event but the very pulse of daily life. The day was not measured in hours but in the 8 canonical prayers from the night office of Matins to the final compline at dusk. This sacred schedule was dictated entirely by the heavens, making every monk, in his own way, an observer of the sky. In cloistered gardens and from simple bell towers, they tracked the sun's path with fixed stone markers called noon dials. They watched for specific stars to appear at twilight, signaling the time for vespers. Their tools were humble, often nothing more than a calibrated staff or a carefully notched window ledge, but their purpose was profound. This was science in the service of worship, a perpetual calibration of human ritual to the divine clockwork above. The monastery became a kind of living observatory, its entire community and daily rhythm an instrument for reading the book of nature. This unbroken tradition of observation, repeated day after day, year after year, across hundreds of monasteries, created something invaluable, a long-term dataset of celestial events. A Benedictine monk in the 10th century, noting an unusually bright star in his chronicle, was not just recording a marvel, he was logging data. A Cistercian brother in the 12th century, meticulously charting the date of the spring equinox for the Easter tables, was contributing to a grand, collective project of understanding time itself. Their motivation was purely liturgical, to ensure the community prayed in unison with the cosmos, yet the effect was to preserve the practical art of astronomy through centuries of war and social upheaval. When royal courts fractured and great libraries scattered, the monasteries remained, their scribes patiently continuing the work. This grassroots integration of spiritual and scientific practice ensured that the flame of celestial observation never went out in the West. The cosmos they recorded was still the familiar Ptolemaic one, but their faithful, unwavering watchfulness kept the skies under a constant, quiet scrutiny, preserving the skills and the curiosity that a future generation would need to see it anew. But the stargazer's quest for divine order had a shadow, one cast by the very human desire to know the future. we must acknowledge the elephant in the room, the practice that was inseparable from astronomy for centuries, astrology. In the medieval mind, the line between observing the planets and interpreting their influence was not just blurry, it was practically non-existent. The same scholar who spent his nights meticulously plotting the orbit of Jupiter might spend his morning casting a horoscope for the Sultan. This was not seen as a contradiction. If the universe was a single, interconnected creation, woven together by the will of God, then it seemed perfectly logical that the grand movements in the heavens would resonate with events here on Earth. The stars were God's instruments, and their motions were a language that could, in theory, be read to understand not just divine mechanics, but divine will for kingdoms and individuals. This belief made astrology a powerful source of patronage. A king's court astronomer was not just a seeker of abstract truth, he was a personal advisor. His ability to produce an accurate ephemeris, a table of planetary positions, was directly linked to his ability to generate horoscopes. Would it be a favorable time for the queen to give birth? Should the army march next week? Or should the coronation be delayed until Venus entered a more auspicious sign? The demand for these answers provided a constant, practical motivation for ever more precise observations. The royal treasury was far more likely to fund a new observatory or a team of calculators if the results could offer a glimpse into the fate of the realm. Yet this cozy relationship faced fierce opposition from within the very religious traditions that powered the observatories. Many Christian and Islamic theologians condemned judicial astrology, the kind that predicted specific human events, as a forbidden form of divination. They argued that it attempted to usurp God's absolute power and freedom, implying that human fates were mechanically determined by the stars rather than shaped by divine grace and free will. A devout astronomer therefore had to perform a delicate balancing act. He could justify his stargazing as exploring God's magnificent creation, while carefully framing his astrological predictions as merely assessing natural influences, not certainties. He was reading the tendencies written in the stars, not writing an unchangeable destiny. This tension between condemnation and practice never truly went away. It forced a constant, internal debate about the limits of knowledge and the boundaries of faith, and in that debate the tools of science were sharpened. The very same planetary tables used to warn a king of an ill omen were the ones that would one day reveal a fundamental flaw in the entire cosmic system, a truth far more revolutionary than any horoscope. The same reverence for celestial order that filled parchment star charts was carved into stone and mortar. If you stand inside a great medieval cathedral like Chartres or walk into the courtyard of a mosque like the Great Mosque of Isfahan, you are not merely in a building. You are inside a functioning astronomical instrument, a sacred machine designed to capture the light of the heavens. The alignment of these structures was the first act of devotion in their construction. A Christian cathedral was almost universally built with its high altar at the eastern end, so that the congregation celebrating the Mass would be facing the direction of the rising sun, a symbol of the resurrection and the second coming of Christ. This was not a vague symbolism. It was a precise orientation, a permanent alignment of the house of God with the daily path of His Son. In Islamic architecture, the Qibla wall in every mosque points the faithful directly toward the Kaaba in Mecca. Determining this direction from hundreds of miles away was one of the most sophisticated problems in spherical astronomy, a calculation that required a deep understanding of the Earth's geometry. The mosque's very footprint was a testament to a celestial calculation made permanent, but the integration went far beyond basic alignment. Look up at a rose window, and you might be looking at a stylized map of the cosmos. Study the floor plan, and you might find a hidden solar calendar. At the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Lyon, a specific window was engineered so that a single beam of sunlight would strike a precise mark on a specific choir stall only once a year on the summer solstice. This was architecture as a cosmic clock, a way of marking God's time in a space dedicated to his worship. The building itself became a collective observatory for the entire community, a place where even an illiterate farmer could witness the perfect, predictable rhythm of the divine by watching a patch of light travel across a stone floor. This was the collision of astronomy and faith made tangible. It was not an abstract debate for scholars. It was the air people breathed and the stone they touched, a daily reminder that the universe was orderly, meaningful, and intimately connected to their prayers. The polished brass of the Astrolabe and the carved stone of the mural quadrant held secrets that were about to travel west. The intellectual inheritance of Maragheh and Samarkand did not vanish. Instead, it sailed across the Mediterranean, carried in the trunks of merchants and the satchels of scholars, to land on the desk of a quiet canon in a small Polish town named Nicolaus Copernicus. When he began his work, he was not staring into a void of ignorance. He was surrounded by books, and many of them were written in Arabic. The star catalogues of Uluğ Bey, the Zij i-Sultani, were among the most accurate data he possessed. The mathematical models of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, specifically his elegant couple that generated linear motion from circles, provided a crucial key. Copernicus used a very similar geometrical device in his own revolutionary book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres to explain the wobble of the Earth's axis. He openly cited the observational work of al-Battani, whose precise calculations of the solar year had refined Ptolemy's own numbers. The European Renaissance, so often portrayed as a sudden rediscovery of classical Greek wisdom, was in fact the culmination of a process. It was the final link in a chain of knowledge that had been forged and refined for centuries in the great observatories of the Islamic world. The so-called Copernican revolution was not a spontaneous explosion of genius. It was a fire lit with fuel gathered by devout astronomers who saw the heavens as a manifestation of divine order. Their faith-driven quest for precision had assembled the very evidence and the very mathematical tools that made a new model of the solar system not just possible, but necessary. The collision of astronomy and faith in the East did not produce a dead end. It built the launchpad for the most dramatic shift in human self-understanding. The star charts and brass instruments were not built by abstract institutions, but by men whose hands were stained with ink and whose hearts were filled with a profound sense of the sacred. To understand their work, we must listen to their own words, not just study their numbers. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, the mastermind of Maragheh, was not merely a mathematician. He was a prominent Shia scholar who wrote extensively on theology and ethics. In his spiritual writings, he described the universe as a grand emanation of divine grace, a system where every celestial sphere in its perfect motion was engaged in an act of perpetual praise. For him, the complex equations he devised to fix the planetary orbits were not a challenge to God. They were a form of intellectual prayer, a way of comprehending the intricate beauty of a creation that was, by its very nature, both rational and worshipful. He saw the human intellect as a divine gift, and using it to unravel the cosmos was the highest form of gratitude. A continent away, King Alfonso X of Castile embodied this same fusion of roles. He was the defender of the Catholic faith, a king sworn to uphold orthodoxy, yet he funded a project that fine-tuned the very machinery of the heavens. How did he reconcile this? His own legal code, the Sayat Potidas, explicitly linked the study of the stars to the knowledge of God. He argued that through astronomy, one could understand the greatness of the Creator, the orderly passage of time, and the marvels he had placed in the sky for human benefit. His famous quip about advising the creator at the moment of creation was not a boast of equality, but an expression of awe at a universe so perfectly logical that a human mind could grasp its underlying principles. For these men, and for so many of their contemporaries, there was no contradiction to resolve. The observatory was their chapel, the astrolabe their rosary, and the act of calculating a planet's path was as devotional as chanting a psalm or reciting the Quran. Their personal faith was the engine of their science, a deep, abiding conviction that to seek truth in the physical world was to draw closer to the source of all truth. This human dimension shatters the modern myth of an inevitable war between science and religion. These giants of astronomy were not secretly agnostic pioneers chafing under the shackles of dogma. They were devout souls who looked at the night sky and saw the face of God, and in their longing to understand that face, they measured the universe. The sheer cost of carving an observatory into a mountain was staggering. We are not talking about funding a single scholar with parchment and ink. This was the scientific equivalent of raising a cathedral or building a royal palace, a massive investment of treasure and manpower. So why did these rulers, often surrounded by political intrigue and military threats, choose to pour fortunes into watching the stars? The answer lies in a powerful blend of faith, power, and practical necessity. For a caliph or a king, patronage of such a grand intellectual project was a direct demonstration of piety. It showed their subjects and their God that they were not merely warriors or tax collectors, but wise stewards of knowledge, fulfilling a divine command to seek understanding. This was public relations on a celestial scale, a way to legitimize their rule by aligning themselves with the cosmic order they were funding to study. The prestige was immense. To have your name forever linked to the most accurate star chart in the world, like Uluğ Bey's Zij-i-Sultani, was to etch your legacy not in the shifting sands of politics, but in the seemingly eternal heavens. A court brimming with the finest astronomers, poets, and mathematicians was a clear signal to rival kingdoms. It announced that your reign was one of enlightenment and unparalleled sophistication, a golden age in the making. Yet beyond the spiritual and political rewards, there were hard, practical returns on this investment. An observatory was not an ivory tower, it was a factory for essential tools. The astronomical tables it produced were vital for creating accurate calendars, which in turn governed agriculture, tax collection, and the scheduling of religious festivals. They provided the data for navigational aids that safeguarded trade routes and expanded commercial empires, and we cannot ignore the role of astrology. The ability to have your court astronomer predict the best time for a coronation, a military campaign, or a royal marriage was seen as a tremendous strategic advantage. The same data used to find the Qibla could be used to cast a horoscope for the crown prince. This flow of practical benefits, from enriching trade to guiding state decisions, made the observatory a sound investment in the stability and prosperity of the realm. The great observatories did not rise despite the economic realities of their time. They rose because patronage was the engine that turned pious curiosity into concrete discovery, proving that the quest for cosmic truth was, in its own way, a supremely rational and rewarding enterprise. Even the most brilliant mind is bound by the tools in its hands. The medieval astronomer's primary instrument was the naked human eye, a remarkable but limited sensor. All their intricate calculations, all their grand theories, rested on observations made without magnification, measuring points of light that were, in reality, unimaginably distant suns. This fundamental constraint shaped their entire understanding of the cosmos. They could track the positions of planets and stars with painstaking care, but they could not see the craters on the moon, the phases of Venus, or the moons of Jupiter. The universe they mapped was a two-dimensional tapestry of lights on a black velvet sheet, its true depth and structure hidden from view. This is why the massive instruments were so crucial. A mural quadrant the size of a building was not a display of excess. It was a desperate, brilliant attempt to compensate for the eye's inherent weakness. By making the scale of their measuring device so immense, they could subdivide its arc into minuscule increments, perhaps down to a single minute of arc. This allowed them to detect the tiny discrepancies in a planet's path that a smaller tool would have missed. They were essentially using engineering to amplify human vision, stretching their technology to its absolute limit to squeeze every last drop of precision from the visible sky. Their models of the universe, for all their complexity, were necessarily built upon this foundation of naked eye data. The epicycles and deferents, the crystalline spheres, were elegant mathematical solutions designed to explain the peculiar loops and retrograde motions they observed from their fixed, earth-bound perspective. They were creating a map that perfectly fit the available landmarks, even if some of those landmarks were misinterpretations. What looks from Earth like a planet doubling back on itself is simply an artifact of orbital mechanics, a truth they could not see without the proper lens. Yet, this very limitation fueled a different kind of genius, one of pure deduction and mathematical creativity. Lacking the ability to see the machinery directly, they reverse-engineered it from its shadow. They listened to the ticking of the cosmic clock and from that sound alone tried to deduce the arrangement of its gears. Their unwavering faith in a rational universe designed by a logical God was their guiding star. They believed that the Creator had established consistent mathematical laws and that even our imperfect, earthbound observations, if made carefully enough, could reveal the echoes of that divine logic. The slight imperfections in their data were not seen as evidence of a flawed creation, but as a challenge to human understanding. It was this pious conviction that the universe was fundamentally knowable that drove them to build ever larger quadrants, to calculate ever more complex equations, and to push their technology to the very brink of what was possible, setting the stage for the moment when a new tool would finally tear the veil away. This pragmatic focus on prediction over physical truth was formalized in a powerful philosophical idea known as saving the phenomena. The primary goal for many of these astronomers was not to prove what the heavens were actually made of, but to construct a mathematical framework, a kind of celestial clockwork, that could accurately forecast where a planet would appear on any given night. If a model, no matter how strange its internal gears might seem, produced numbers that matched the observed positions of Mars or Venus, it was considered a success. It had saved the phenomena. Think of it like a modern weather app on your phone. The app uses complex models to predict a 70% chance of rain this afternoon. You do not need to believe the app's code is a literal, physical cloud inside your device. You only care that its prediction is reliable enough for you to decide to carry an umbrella. The model saves the phenomenon of rain, and its usefulness is all that matters. This approach granted medieval scholars a crucial intellectual flexibility. A Christian astronomer could use Ptolemy's Earth-centered system with its complex epicycles to calculate Easter, while privately wondering if it was merely a brilliant calculating device, not a perfect picture of God's actual architecture. A Muslim mathematician could employ al-Tusi's ingenious couple to fix a planetary orbit, viewing it as a magnificent abstract tool that demonstrated God's love of elegant geometry, without being forced to claim that literal, rolling circles existed in the sky. Saving the phenomena created a protected space for scientific work to continue and improve, even when a full-scale cosmological revolution was still centuries away. It was a sophisticated, almost modern, understanding of the relationship between a model and reality. The map is not the territory, and a useful map is a treasure, even if the territory itself remains shrouded in mystery. For centuries, a single star chart was a treasure locked in a chest. The creation of a zij, those masterful astronomical tables, was an act of endurance. Before a single calculation could begin, a scholar needed access to precious source manuscripts, often unique copies held in distant observatory libraries. A team of human computers would then perform thousands of complex mathematical operations, their quills scratching across parchment in a symphony of concentration. Then came the scribes, whose task was to copy the final, verified results with flawless penmanship. A single mistake in a number, one slip of the pen, could render an entire column of data useless, wasting months of work. This slow, expensive, and vulnerable process meant that cutting-edge celestial knowledge was a rare commodity, concentrated in the hands of the powerful patrons who could afford to produce it. The observatory was not just a place of discovery, but the sole publisher of its own truth. This all changed with the low, rhythmic creak of a wooden screw. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century did not just speed up book production, it fundamentally altered the ecology of knowledge. Suddenly, an astronomer in a small German town could own an identical copy of the same star tables used by a scholar in Krakow. The printed book democratized the heavens, breaking the monopoly of the great centralized institutions. But this new power came with a hidden cost. The printed page bestowed a strange authority. An error, once trapped in a single manuscript, could now be replicated 1,000 times over, spreading a tiny flaw across a continent with the permanence of ink. The very act of fixing knowledge in print also began to fossilize it. A model that was once debated and corrected in manuscript margins now faced the world as a finished, unchangeable product. The printed book created a new, wider audience for astronomy, but it was an audience that no longer needed to pilgrimage to Maragheh or Samarkand to read the stars. The slow decline of the patron-funded observatory had begun, not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless stamp of a printing press. The intimate collision of faith and science, once curated by sultans and kings, was now spilling out into the public square, ready for anyone with the coin to buy a book and the curiosity to read it. Nicolaus Copernicus did not invent his new universe from nothing. He was a man standing on a mountain of data, a scholar whose quiet revolution in a small Polish town was the direct inheritance of every star chart and zij compiled in the great observatories of the East. When he began his calculations on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, he was not working in an intellectual vacuum. The most accurate observational data he had came from the star catalogues of the Timurid Sultan, Uluğ Bey. The mathematical tools he used to explain the wobble of the Earth's axis were nearly identical to the Tusi-couple, a device invented centuries earlier by Nasir al-Din al-Tusi to repair the Ptolemaic model. His work is unthinkable without the centuries of pious observation that came before him, but his debt was more than just technical. The very intellectual space that allowed him to propose a sun-centered system was carved out by the long medieval dialogue between faith and reason. Copernicus was a canon of the Catholic Church, a man deeply embedded in a religious institution. His driving motivation was not to dethrone God, but to restore a deeper sense of divine harmony to the cosmos. He looked at the old Ptolemaic system with its clunky epicycles and awkward equants, and saw not just mathematical inelegance but a philosophical mess. How could the Creator's perfect machine be so convoluted? He sought a system that was simpler, more balanced, and more beautifully ordered, a system worthy of a supreme architect. This was a profoundly medieval desire, the same impulse that drove the builders of cathedrals to align them with the solstice sun, and the astronomers of Maragheh to fix the heavens with geometry. The Copernican revolution was not the moment astronomy broke free from faith. It was the moment a new, more powerful harmony was proposed, a harmony built on a foundation laid by devout minds who believed the universe was above all, rationally and beautifully made. A sultan's dream carved in stone could not withstand the shifting sands of politics. The vast empires that had funded the great observatories were not eternal. Dynasties fell, treasuries were emptied by war, and a new ruler's passion might lie in conquest rather than cataloguing stars. The observatory at Samarkand, Uluğ Bey's life's work, was abandoned and fell into ruin not long after his death. The intellectual fortress of Maragheh was eventually silenced. These were not just buildings closing, but an entire model of scientific discovery fading away, one dependent on the personal piety and wealth of a single powerful individual. When that patronage vanished, the work often stopped. Yet the human desire to understand the skies did not disappear. It simply found a new home. That new home was the university. From Oxford to Bologna, Paris to Prague, these were also religious institutions often founded by the church. But their purpose was different. They were not built to serve a king's horoscope or a caliph's decree. They were communities of masters and students, organized around the pursuit of knowledge through a specific, powerful method, disputation. In a university, an idea was not accepted because a patron endorsed it, but because it had survived a formal, public debate. A scholar proved his worth not by producing a useful table for the royal court, but by earning a degree, a license to teach that was recognized across Christendom. This created a portable, professional identity for a thinker. He was a master of arts, not merely a court astronomer. The funding model shifted too. While still supported by the church and wealthy benefactors, the university's financial foundation was more diffuse, built on endowments, student fees, and a corporate structure that could outlive any single donor. This was science becoming institutionalized. It was no longer a magnificent, one-off project, but a continuous, self-perpetuating enterprise. The focus of inquiry began to change as well. The university scholar was often more concerned with reconciling ancient authorities like Aristotle with Christian doctrine than with making new observations of the planets. The curriculum was based on set texts, and advancement came through logical argument within that framework. This environment could be rigid, but it also provided a stable platform for generations of thinkers to train, debate, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, build upon the knowledge that had flowed in from the great observatories of the past. The age of the cosmic monument was over, but the age of the academic community had begun, setting the stage for a different kind of collision, one that would happen not on a palace grounds, but in the lecture halls and libraries of Europe. The ghost of Uluğ Bey's ambition still lies upon that Samarkand hillside. You can walk there today and see it, a long, dark trench carved deep into the yellow earth, a curved scar running through the foundations of a later building. This is all that remains of his colossal sextant, the instrument that once reached for the stars. The stone ark is gone, looted for other constructions, leaving only its negative impression, like a fossil of a cosmic thought. It is a hauntingly beautiful ruin, a monument not to destruction but to absence. Far to the west in Iran, the Maragheh Observatory offers a different kind of silence. Scattered across a windswept plateau are the crumbled footings of walls and the stumps of fallen towers. Among the rubble, you might find a fragment of a ceramic water pipe, part of the complex infrastructure that supported the scholars who worked here, or a piece of tile from a dome that once shimmered in the sun. These are not grand structures, they are echoes. To stand in these places is to feel the profound disconnect between their current state and the intellectual thunder that once resided here. These stones are the last witnesses to a conversation between earth and sky that lasted for centuries. They do not speak of dogma or conflict. They testify to a staggering investment of human genius, wealth, and faith, all directed toward a single, unified goal. The very fact that these sites were abandoned, allowed to be reclaimed by the earth, tells its own story about the fragility of knowledge, about how easily a golden age can fade when its patrons fall and its political purpose shifts. Yet their excavation and preservation, however incomplete, speaks to a modern desire to reclaim that lost chapter. To run your hand over the precise groove meant for an astronomer's sighting instrument is to touch the same stone he touched. It collapses 7 centuries in an instant. This is where the collision of astronomy and faith becomes physical. You are not just reading about it, you are standing on the platform where it happened, on the very ground where a devout man measured the light of a distant star, believing it would bring him closer to God. These architectural ghosts ask us a quiet but persistent question. What grand endeavors are we building today that future generations might one day puzzle over, seeing only fragments in the soil, wondering at the unity of purpose that could have raised them? The silent stones of Maragheh and Samarkand ask a difficult question of our modern age. We often inherit a story of inevitable conflict, a grand war between the cold, hard facts of science and the warm, comforting truths of faith. Yet the history written in those observatory ruins tells a completely different tale. For the scholars who worked there, the universe was a single, magnificent text with 2 complementary parts. One was the revealed word of Scripture, the other was the observed word of nature, and both were authored by the same divine hand. To study one was to better understand the other. This medieval view of a created, rational, and beautiful cosmos presents a powerful challenge to the simplistic conflict thesis that dominates so much of our public conversation today. Many contemporary scientists and theologians are now looking back to this integrated model, not as a historical curiosity, but as a source of inspiration. They argue that seeing the natural world as inherently meaningful and orderly can actually deepen scientific curiosity. The physicist who marvels at the elegant mathematics underlying the universe, or the biologist who sees profound complexity in a single cell, is expressing a sense of wonder that feels remarkably close to the devotional awe of a medieval astronomer. The foundational assumption that the cosmos is comprehensible, that it operates by consistent laws we can discover, is itself a philosophical inheritance from a worldview that believed in a rational creator. This does not mean a return to a geocentric universe or a rejection of evolution. It is about recovering a sense of the whole. The medieval model suggests that our drive to understand the how of the universe can coexist with our need to ask why. The story of these observatories shows us that the most profound discoveries often occur not when one way of knowing tries to dominate the other, but when they enter into a respectful and creative dialogue, each asking its own questions of a reality that is far too vast for any single perspective to fully contain. Perhaps their greatest legacy is the quiet proof that the human hunger for truth is not divided into separate compartments, but is one single, enduring flame. The great medieval observatories stand as monumental testaments to a time when the human gaze turned skyward, was guided by both a quest for empirical truth and a profound sense of spiritual wonder. These were not sites of a quiet truce between 2 opposing forces, but vibrant workshops where faith and science were partners in a single, magnificent endeavor. From the bustling translation halls of the House of Wisdom to the colossal stone sextant of Samarkand, we have traced a path lit by a shared conviction. Faith provided the powerful motivation, the generous patronage of kings and caliphs, and the very philosophical framework that saw the cosmos as a rational, divine creation worthy of intense study. This was not a conflict to be won, but a dynamic and productive dialogue that propelled human knowledge forward for centuries. The true legacy of these institutions is not just found in the precise star charts and revolutionary mathematical models they produced, though these tools would one day help launch a new vision of the solar system. Their most enduring gift is the powerful, almost forgotten idea that seeking to understand our universe can be one of the deepest forms of reverence. To measure a star's path was to appreciate the architect's skill. To calculate an orbit was to comprehend a fragment of the Creator's mind. As we today push the boundaries of exploration, building space telescopes that see back to the dawn of time, we would do well to remember the lessons of those sacred spaces. The medieval observatories teach us that our drive to know the cosmos is a profoundly human impulse, one that can unite the curiosity of the intellect with the yearning of the spirit in a single, glorious pursuit. If this journey through the heavens has inspired you, share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more voyages into the wonders of history.